resilience of Australia's infrastructure sector to climate extreme challenges and opportunities. So, infrastructure provides foundation of our economic activities, competitiveness, and prosperity. So, it's very crucial that we ensure that we can maintain that services that infrastructure provides, even under extreme conditions. So, in Australia, we have a problem of different multitude of problems. We have some backlog of infrastructure, as well as we have some aging infrastructure. And so there likely to be a significant amount of investment coming up in the next couple of decades, and some of the figures that are coming out from the different reports looks like about $1.1 trillion will be invested by 2050. On the other hand, climate is changing, sea level is rising, and we're seeing a lot of extreme events as we go. And we have learned from our speakers throughout the day that these extreme events can have a significant impact on our infrastructure systems. And we have seen some examples, recent examples from Cyclone Debbie caused massive damage in southern Queensland, and the simple tornado in South Australia triggered a statewide blackout. So it's important that to understand and think about these challenges of future infrastructure planning, and in order to discuss those things, today we have 5 leading experts in Australia in the field of infrastructure and climate adaptation among us. So in my left I have David Singleton, current chairman of Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, and also the chair of University of Swinburne Smart City Research Advisory Board. And then we have Roger Tomlinson, is the professor at Griffith University. Then we got David Hood, who is he's an adjunct professor at QUT. We got Greg Fisk from BMT WBM, and we got Deputy Director of NCAF, David Rissick. So welcome everyone in our panel. So we have too many Davids in the panel, so I have to be very strategic about asking questions. So please bear with me. So we all know the importance of infrastructure resilience. We will know that. And from your position, I'll start kicking off the discussion by a general question. That from your position, that what you do, what do you think as a most important challenge of increasing resilience of our infrastructure system? So I might start with David Singleton. David, yeah. So you have been part of ARUP's infrastructure team for some time now. So you might give us some perspective.
Well, I guess in the first place, the challenge is that people don't really understand what is meant by resilience. It's actually quite a subtle concept, and so I don't think the general public understands it, and I certainly don't think politicians understand it. So I think there's an education exercise to be undertaken to help people get what that topic is about. And I think in that regard, what 100 Resilient Cities, Rockefeller and so on, have been doing, working with cities around the world to encourage those cities to develop resilience plans, has been very useful, because it's started to illustrate in a place that people know what resilience might mean in Melbourne versus Brisbane versus New York versus Amsterdam.
So the comparison of among different things. So if that's quite an interesting point. So if I ask a similar question to Roger, you have worked with local councils for some time now. So if we think about from a local perspective, what do you think that the challenge of infrastructure resilience from local councils' perspective?
From a coastal point of view, as I said in my talk, the big issue is we don't really understand terribly well what we've got, never alone how resilient it's going to be into the future. But the other key element, and it really came out in a symposium we ran through our Gold Coast Waterways Authority about waterway resilience, and challenge the community to sort of start talking about things that we could implement. To my mind, there was a complete disjoint between what we might think of as a resilience approach from a technical or scientific or knowledgeable point of view and what the community members thought you could actually do. So I think it comes back to what David number one here said, is about that education about what it's really all about.
So, David Hood, so how do we increase this education among our asset managers or our planners? How do we make that increased level of awareness about resilience?
I'll assume the title of David 2 then, if it's all right with you, David 1 and David 3. D3. Just if I can preface my comment by saying that it's not just sustainability, climate change, things that we think of and that I spoke about this morning that we need resilience to. Some of the big issues coming up, for instance, are the massive technology changes that we're going to face. And I sort of point out Carmageddon, which is an incredible piece that was written just recently about the impact of 3 technologies that are going to just blow transport apart. One is, of course, electric vehicles. The second is artificial intelligence incorporation into those electric vehicles and self-drive cars and things. And the last one is the apps that are going to just compound the whole lot. We will see a massive change. And this article I read says 3 to 5 years, we won't have transport as we know it now. You'll pick up your iPhone, you'll just put in where you want to go, and a driverless car will turn up outside, and for the cost of a cup of coffee, it'll take you where you're going. That will absolutely impact our cities incredibly, because at this moment, the city is designed for the car. Have you ever tried to cross a main street in the city? Cars get about 5 or 6 minutes, you get 30 seconds to get across the road. Those changes are going to really blow us apart. And resilience is part of, we've got to think of those things in resilience. Also, the political situation is going to change drastically. Another article I just read recently which frightened me was that young people around the world are now losing faith in democracy. So what are they sort of thinking about? Are they thinking about dictatorships being better than democracy? And we just see what happens with Trump and Brexit and all these other things, and Turkey and Greece and things. The changes are phenomenal in terms of what resilience means. And that then features into your question about education. It's not just educating for climate change and the sort of sustainability, corporate social responsibilities issues. It's educating that's going to have to be totally different to all of the things that will impact us. And I really, that's a challenge, an incredible challenge for universities.
That's a challenge in a bigger scale, I guess. So I'll go to Greg now. Greg, you have been working with transport operators for some time now, and you have worked with Brisbane Airport in their second runway project, and you have worked with Cairns and Mackay Airport as well about their climate change related issues. So what do you think about if you think about from transport sector's perspective, what is the main challenge of increasing resilience of transport sector?
Yeah, I think maybe picking up on D2's points was that they know that they've got a lot of pressures, and climate change is just and resilience is just another one to add to shopping cart in the context of a Kindle analogy. So I think there's great trepidation to even engage in the issue because it just becomes another thing to worry about that's going to have to be dealt with by a dwindling budget. I think the message that I would say is that I think transport authorities are very, very good at managing extreme weather events. They always have been. And climate change resilience and the resilience of assets to future climate can be a logical extension of how they're actually managing extreme weather events now. And if you think of it like that, it's not so scary and it's not so hard. And you've got a starting point to say, well, this is how we're managing these things now. Do I need to radically change what I'm doing, or do I need to do some tweaking around the edges? So I think in that context, rather than turning it into an issue that's too hard and I don't know where to start with something that you actually are familiar with and you're good at, and say, well, how do I need to change this? How do I need to tweak this? And then, as a scientist, a social scientist in postgrad that works with a lot of engineers, you can engage the engineers because then you're in solution mode. You're not actually in problem mode. And I think that's the other challenge is that, if you, in the academic world who write about climate change and resilience and adaptation, it's all about more and more articulation of the problem. And, engineers and scientists, we should be on about solutions. So I think it's you got to build from your strengths, and you can't be afraid to actually take it on.
That's a great point. So while thinking about solution, everything ultimately comes down to available fund, I guess. So Dave, at the end of, you have been working in the space of adaptation and policy for some time now, and you have done some great work with Investor Group of Climate Change about funding mechanism for adaptation projects. So do you think that funds are the biggest hurdle in this resilience equation?
I wouldn't say it's the biggest hurdle, but I'd say it is a big hurdle. I still think that we need to be actually displaying some leadership, and I think that infrastructure gives us a hell of an opportunity to show leadership, because infrastructure is everything. I was thinking about, it connects people, it connects economies, it's national security, it's everything around that we do relies on infrastructure. And so with the right leadership, we can actually change the way that we do leadership. At the moment, for instance, the government seems to love funding roads. So they are really driving us towards a carbon-intensive future. Whereas if they put a hell of a lot more effort into funding rail, they can change the way that we are as a nation. And they can do that, but yet they don't. But we do need to fund stuff. And I think that the amount of money, and I mentioned it earlier, the superannuation industry hold gives them the opportunity to really drive some of this leadership in the country as well, because they can afford to do things, and they are looking at ways of investing their money for the long-term future. They're starting to work more closely with local government, which they haven't done before, and think about what local government's needs are in terms of developing infrastructure, and how they can actually, what is required to set it up so that they can actually invest into something and find a way of paying the returns that the investors need. But it's early days, but I see that we'll be able to inject a lot of this superannuation driven money into developing new infrastructure. But we need to make sure that we're not just developing old stuff. We need to be moving forward.
That's a great point, that investing in resilience actually makes sense. And if you look at the figures about economic cost of disasters in Australia, they're quite astonishing. In 2015, total economic cost of natural disaster event in Australia exceeded about 9 billion, which is about 0.6% of our GDP, domestic GDP. These costs are expected to rise to an average of about 33 billion per year by 2050. And between 2002 and 2011, more than 450 million was spent each year by Australian governments to restore critical infrastructure after disaster. And this is almost equal to 1.6% of total public infrastructure spending. And so this figure suggests that we are not doing very good in proactive planning. So we are very good in being reactive. And so we keep building infrastructure in harm's way. So how do we fix it? So it's an open question. I'll throw it to the panel if you feel free to jump in.
So I can say this now because I'm no longer associated with a particular firm. That firm did a lot of work on the Queensland reconstruction after the floods. And a constraint in the way disaster relief funding works meant that the federal government money would only be paid to Queensland if the assets were rebuilt to the standard they were at before. Which is why you saw in the next flood the same bridges being washed away, because they were rebuilt exactly as they were. There was no intelligence employed. Well, there was intelligence, it wasn't allowed to be employed. So that's an example of something much, much bigger, which is, I think, that we are actually dealing with a complex system. It's not just,
an asset or a type of asset, we need to understand that supermarkets are now restocked, overnight. They don't carry stocks for more than a day or possibly two. Hospitals, need to be accessible by more than one route, and so on and so on and so on. So when we start thinking about the resilience of urban systems, we actually have to start thinking in a systemic way. And I'm afraid that's not something. I think the professions know how to do it. They're not encouraged to do so because funding does not flow in a systemic way.
There's not enough incentive to do that.
They're actually pretty constrained, even though they do speak with an independent voice. They don't stray far from the estate because there's not a lot of future in saying lots of things that the government are not going to support. I mean that's the challenge to all professionals, I think, but not David too.
In the early days of AGIC, as it was before ISCA, I spent a bit of time with Infrastructure Australia trying to get them to help us with the development of the tool. And the culture within the organisation then was anti-sustainability. They didn't even consider it. They weren't going to. It wasn't in their charter, all those sort of excuses, despite the fact that on their advisory board were some pretty smart sustainability leaders, if you like. Peter Newman, for instance, people like that. So my take on it is that we've got to think about infrastructure that is, let me start by saying, what's the opposite of fragile? No, it's anti-fragile. And we've got to design anti-fragile infrastructure. That is, now let's think about Arnie Schwarzenegger. What does he do when he's building his muscles? He damages them. He damages them and he damages them and they build back stronger automatically. That's the body system that we have. Think of that. That's anti-fragile. So that when something is broken, you repair it better. And that's the point David made. They weren't considering anti-fragile when they replaced the flood damage in Brisbane. Remember that term, anti-fragile.
I just wanted to reiterate the point that David just made, and I was in Washington DC last year giving a talk to the Federal Emergency Management Agencies, so FEMA, are part of Homeland Security, and they look after all the flood insurance, which is a very top-down approach in the US, and they're looking at our model and marvelling at our proactivity in terms of planning and how we actually try to avoid these problems from a land use planning perspective before they start. What they have on us is the anti-fragile. They are ready to go when an emergency hits, because that's their funding. That's when the funding comes in from the federal government, and that's when the money's available. So they very much take this approach that we'll build in the resilience once the disaster happens, and we're ready to go, and we've got the plans ready to go, and we know exactly what we're going to do, and we know exactly what it's going to cost. So it's a different way of looking at it. I think you need both, but it certainly is a different way of looking at it, and it does prevent David S's comment around building the same bridge that gets knocked out by the same flood 3 years in a row.
I will say that the third time some of those bridges got knocked down, the Queensland Reconstruction Authority did start thinking about betterment at some certain scales, but it's not across the board because they can't get the money, but they do get some resources from the Commonwealth. They can identify some assets that they can then build back better. So that's good, and they do have they are showing some leadership in that regard. And I just wanted to follow up on Infrastructure Australia. I do know that they are talking, so they're not necessarily doing anything yet, but they are starting to talk to groups at CSIRO and other places to think about how they might be able to start considering climate change in the guidance that they then give to the funding that they hand out.
And pray it doesn't rain before.
Okay, so we talked a lot about challenges, but I'm sure there are some opportunities around. So let's spend some time and let's finish it off on a high note. So integration of digital and physical infrastructure is likely to become a norm in the future, right? So we are likely to see a surge of smart cities, smart infrastructure, and we have heard in the morning in the plenary about the internet revolution 4.0 and artificial intelligence and big data and so on and so forth. So I'll start with David Sinclair. You are doing quite a lot of work in this space, and you are Swinburne University Smart Cities Research Institute Advisory Board. What role do you think this evolution of smart infrastructures and all other things can play to increase our resilience? Or is it just a myth?
Oh, no, it's not a myth. But on the other hand, there is a danger that we sort of drown in data. So we go from not having much data a few years ago to now having more data than we kind of know what to do with. So you do need to have a very clear framework to understand how you're going to use the available data, and there is a lot of learning happening in that space, and there's a lot of cooperation between councils. It's mainly happening at the city level rather than the state or federal level in Australia, and that is certainly the experience from the States and from Europe, that this is very much a city thing, and the the experience around the 100 resilient cities, that has been a very city-based approach. I just say one more thing, which is not exactly on your point before I no longer have the microphone. In your slide, David R., where you pointed out what tools were available, I'd just like to note that the IS tool is not only useful for looking at new infrastructure, you can use it to look at existing infrastructure, and you can use it to fine-tune the way you manage existing infrastructure. And I would go on to say you can therefore understand, what are the sensitivities, the vulnerabilities of the infrastructure you have. So, an important point.
So Roger, research and innovation can open door for new opportunities in this space, and you have been working in the academia and you're involved in the research for some time now. So what do you think research can play a role in identifying these opportunities and making use of them for increasing resilience of our infrastructure?
From a research point of view, we're always seeking data to do things, to develop better models and that kind of thing. But what I've observed is, and this is same for whether it's water quality data or beach profile survey data or whatever it is, we're still stuck in a paradigm of data collection which is driven by who's got the budget, and they like to spread that budget evenly out over the year. So water quality is a classic example. You go and collect a sample once a month at a time that suits the person selecting the data, going out into the field, and that might be fine for a long-term average, but it's no use at all in terms of improving our understanding of what the problems are that we are dealing with, which are event-based usually. And certainly in the coastal context, a comment was made before about, if we focus on the extreme events, we probably ticked off most of the boxes in terms of adaptation anyway, but we don't get the answers to that unless we target the event that we already have. And so I think that to really become more proactive and to advance our understanding of process, we really need to be rethinking the way we collect data, because we waste an awful lot of money collecting information that really just tells you about the past rather than what the future might look like.
Exactly, and that needs, I think, a lot of leadership. And my next question would be with you: what role do you think leadership can play in tapping into those opportunities?
Depends where you define leadership. Certainly not in the political arena, but leadership is essential, and that's why I plead with engineers to actually grasp the leadership role. Engineers traditionally are conservative and reticent, backroom sort of things. I'm a bit of a strange engineer. I'm actually an honorary woman. Some people don't realise that, but the Women in Engineering conferred that title on me a few years back. I gave them a bit of money for a big project. But where do we get that leadership? How do we really go about leading? I think one of the things that we've got to start realising is that we really do have a crisis on our hands in the future. The Club of Rome told us in 1972 that we're headed for trouble. CSIRO did some work only a few years back that said we're right on track with the Club of Rome's forecasts, which means that, next 10 years we could see the society, the economic systems and so on collapsing. We've already seen 2008, which a lot of people say might be the just start of this. I think we've got to show the leadership in actually telling the truth. It's no good saying, we can't use the term emergency or bloody crisis or things like that, because that frightens the people. I think the people deserve the truth, and it's not leadership to hide the truth from the people. And you don't get mobilisation, and politicians are frightened of mobilisation. If they see all the people coming behind a cause and saying we want change, they will change. They won't unless that happens, because those people vote them in and they can be easily swayed. So it's a big task to actually mobilise people. And I read an article the other day that said the avoidance of doom and gloom is dooming us all. We've got to start saying, hey, we do have a problem. The truth is this. And science is the search for truth. So why do we have such anti-science at the moment? And Trump and people like that, just, is that leadership? They put him in there? I mean, that's a classic example of politicians are not leaders. So it's a difficult question. It comes back to education. I think we've got to make people aware, give them the tools to actually grasp the leadership and get out there and do it.
That's a great point, and that's the leadership that we are seeing nowadays is probably, you can say, leadership 2.0. There's a different dimension of leadership. Do you want to add anything with that, Greg and Dave, before we pass it on to...
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just raise an issue. I do a lot of risk workshops around Australia with a community, with practitioners, planners, engineers, scientists, and I think, I put it on my slide this morning about the criticality of consequence. With so much data around, with the maps saying all the problems you're going to see, particularly infrastructure I've been involved in the newspaper, it's going to go underwater, what are you doing about it? I mean, the first thing I tend to ask in a group of people when we're thinking about a class of assets and how they could be affected, and somebody will ask, well, what if it floods? And my answer will be, it gets wet. And the issue there is that it's the consequence of it getting wet which is important. And it's understanding as an asset manager, well, how long can it stay wet for before it starts to cost money? How much is that going to have an impact on the service functionality of the asset? And in that context, climate change is just another thing for the asset manager to think about. So if you work back from the fact of, and this is a little bit negative, so clouding the sunshine you wanted us to be positive about was, I often ask asset managers to say, well, what's the absolute minimum level of service you would be willing to allow this asset to provide? or what's the most you'd be willing to actually spend to actually maintain it. And if you can establish that as your objective, then you can work back and say, all right, well, what are my trigger points along the way, and at what stage from a cost-benefit analysis do I need to think about different options? But often, we think about trying to solve climate change, and we don't need to solve climate change. We just need to solve how climate change affects our asset and working back. So I think that's an important sort of practical way of actually thinking about, how you can approach this issue and start to get on top of it rather than it play you.
Before afternoon tea on strategic asset management and, understanding that choosing the level of service you want your asset to deliver is really what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think the last point there is you do have to engage with the community and say, you mightn't be able to, from a water quality perspective, and Dave and I were involved in 15 years ago, you mightn't be able to live in the abattoir, have your kids fish in the creek and catch a fish and be able to drink the water. All those things in the same creek mightn't be possible. So you may need to, in terms of doom and gloom, you may need to say, well, I can't provide the same level of service that I've been able to provide in the past. This is what I am able to provide, and that's sort of the best. That's what it's going to cost, and this is what. So there's that transparency. If you ask a person to make a trade-off and not actually indicate to them what the trade-off is, they're not going to be able to make the decision.
Yes. It's more like a bottom-up approach coming up from the final remarks, Dave?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to hark back again to the opportunities that we can get from infrastructure, and think about trying to drive the people who pay for the infrastructure to start thinking more effectively themselves. So why do we keep on building aged care facilities in the cheapest, low-lying, most at-risk places around the country? That's dumb. We've got an aging population where more and more people are going to be putting in these situations, and we're going to have to put in processes to rescue them and to get them out of harm's way, yet we continue to do it. So I think it's incumbent on the infrastructure managers and designers to be pushing back at the people who are asking them to do dumb things, because we're still getting dumb guidance and dumb requests from the people at the top. And if the leadership's not coming from the top, well, then let's take it a step below that and push back.
Here, here.
Okay, with that note, I'll ask the audience, do you have any question? We can take one or two questions before we...
Yeah, hi, my name's Jeremy Novak. I did my PhD in resilience engineering and what have you, but I've got a bit of a side question for you, a more contemporary one. Recently, in the last week or so, you've had the UK announce that they're going to ban fossil fuel cars. You talked about leadership in government. How do you think that's going to affect the decisions in other countries, especially in Australia?
I think France is doing the same thing. They're banning cars. There's a lot of that going on in Europe. Australia will push back as long as it possibly can, because we've got big distances. We've got challenges to actually do to actually implement that ourselves, and we'll find that because we are a government that's driven a lot by rural seats, that those guys will have the final words in the electorate, and we'll be dragging the chain for a while. Hopefully, technology can come along and help sweeten the way. But there was somebody who phoned up the radio station I was listening to at night and said, until they bring out an electric car that can pull my caravan and let me drive around Australia, I'm not going to ever give up fossil fuels.
But from my background, primarily with airports and seaports, the upgrades that are driving infrastructure continue to be the technology rather than the world around us. The A380 changed terminals in terms of having to have 2 aero bridges and wider runways and longer runways. All the ports are now having to widen their channels to accommodate the post-Panamax ships and the cruise ships, which are so high that they blow in the wind and hard to actually keep on track through the bends. in the channels. So I think there's always going to be an issue of infrastructure catching up with the technology, and probably roads and rails with driverless cars will be the same. I guess it's the question of how fast they can actually make that transition, and in that context, can they do it efficiently and build some resilience along the way?
I always remember having an argument with Dick Smith when he was chairman of the Civil Aviation Authority. He said we're going to have affordable safety in the air, but you've all got to realise you're going to die in aeroplanes. Because he said, well, you accept dying in the cars, why don't you accept dying in aeroplanes? The argument went along the fact that you're in control of your car, you're not necessarily in control of your aeroplane. And he went on and on and on. I said, Dick, the problem with your statements is that most people are killed in their car within 10 kilometres of their home. That's a statistical fact. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but it is. And I said, Dick, you cannot catch an aeroplane to the shops. He looked at me for a minute and said, you bloody engineers, you always spoil a good story, don't you? I think don't get me started on bloody cruise ships either. It's unsustainable. I mean, aviation is an unsustainable industry. Just think how you make aluminium. For every tonne of aluminium, you put about 30 tonnes of CO2 in the atmosphere. How many tonnes of aluminium in a 747? Anyone know? 97 tonnes. So, and multiply that by 31, that's even before the bugger flies. So there are problems with the shift that's going to happen. But I think that the very fast train, for instance, will make a big difference if we only get the will to put the very fast train, first of all, from Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney and Brisbane, and it can be done. BZE showed it can be done $30 billion less than the government's. AECOM, I think, did the work for the government, didn't they? So we can do it. It just takes leadership.
So one final remark before we finish it off. So we in the audience, some of us are working in the space of asset management, some of us are studying and doing some research. So when we go back to our work after this conference and this session, what is the one thing that we should be thinking of considering doing in terms of increasing resilience of our infrastructure, of whatever things we are doing? Any, like a generic comment quickly within 30 seconds if you could.
Find out what you've got and how it's functioning now, because we can't go forward unless we know that.
Pick up your free copy of Infrastructure Sustainability and Why It's Good for Business. QUT stand outside. There's still about 60 copies left out there, so pick that up and implement it. Think about how you can look at the business case and convince your board to actually implement sustainability beyond regulation.
I think my key message is it's not so bad. In a small amount of time, you can get a fairly good understanding of your relative vulnerability. What you then need to do is really think about how it could affect your assets. Think about that issue I raised about what's the worst possible scenario and work back. And I think you can develop an internal climate change strategy and a level of preparedness in a very short amount of time from the bottom up.
I'd say learn a little bit about some of the concepts that are being started to be used, such as pathways, and think about how you can build infrastructure or develop infrastructure that can be developed on as we go forward and doesn't have to be started up from scratch, so we can beat climate change at its own game.
Great. So we heard some very valuable insight from our panelists. I think we need to wrap up now and conclude this discussion. If you want to continue discussing, I think some of them will be hanging around after this for the welcome reception, so feel free to catch them. And for now, please join me thanking our panelists for their wonderful insights.